On today's episode, we go and pick up a donor car. Heading to go pick up a car I bought, sight unseen. A little interested to see how this is going to go, but I broke two of the cardinal rules. Don't buy a car in the rain, don't buy a car you've never seen. So this should be a good one. Stay tuned. Oh my god, what did I just buy? This is so awesome. Before we jump into today's episode, I thought it would be important to quickly visit what I want to see from this build and why I chose the direction I chose, and get into the whole conversation about where this project is headed. I want to kind of start off back when I was 16, 17, 18, when I had purchased my very first Volkswagen. It was a Mark 1 Rabbit, actually very similar to this, except it was silver when I first bought it. It was 1980, 1.8, 8 valve, very similar in many ways to this car. But I truly fell in love with these cars back then. There's something about the raw feeling of these cars, not having air conditioning and power steering and take away all the creature comforts. It's just you, the car, a little bit of power, and the road. And I think that set the stage for what I would truly try and find for the rest of my life when buying and playing with cars. Was just something that was sporty, held the roads. You had a great deal of feel with the car, and I feel like this car, or this platform at least, is unmatched when looking at even other Volkswagens for that matter. Maybe it's arguably you can find the same kind of rough feel in a Mark II as well, but I kind of really enjoy not only the way these cars look, the way they handle, the way they deal with their power, all that kind of thing. I've had many cars in my life, everything from, Fords and Chevs and all that kind of stuff, to Japanese cars, to, my fair shake of Volkswagens as well. I've had pretty much every Mark, all the way up to Mark 7 there is, but even when I got to Mark 7, I reverted right back to, the earlier cars. There's something about these earlier cars that just you cannot find in any other car. And a lot of that has to do with the user. Maybe that's just me, but there's something about these Volkswagens that I truly, fell in love with from day one, and have always been, had a direct relationship with, and it's something I can't turn away from. So, anyways, when I was 16, 17, building my first Mark 1, my dream car back then, or my dream project, was to VR6 my car. And you have to remember, back in, those days, that was the early to mid to late 90s. You're starting to look at VR6 cars and what was available for parts and all that kind of thing. That type of build was unattainable. People were doing it, but it was people with much larger budgets than I can ever dream of. The challenge of doing that swap was a lot more laborious back then. You're talking about taking subframe mounts from current VR6 cars and finding a way to graft those onto a Mark 1, often bringing subframes from Corrados or other VR6 platforms over to these cars. Swap kits and aftermarket support didn't really exist back then, so for me it was something I really wanted. It was in magazines, and it was what people were doing on the upper echelon of these builds, putting some massive power in these cars. It's something I always wanted to do, but at the time it wasn't achievable. I just couldn't do it. I knew at some point that project would become more affordable, more budget, as those VR6 cars became older. Maybe there was an opportunity in the future, but anyways, I enjoyed the car I had back then. Eventually I did sell it, and I moved on to other Volkswagen, bought Mark IIs, Mark IIIs, Mark IVs, and eventually worked myself up to even Mark 7. Got into Japanese cars and North American cars and all kinds of things, but I always loved my connection with these cars, and throughout my entire life, at one point or another, I had a Volkswagen somewhere in my group of cars, and there was a little 4 or 5 year gap when I no longer had one anymore, and I always kind of dreamed about getting back into them. So then came the time where I decided now was the better time than any. So I went out and found another Mark 1 Rabbit and said, you know what, I'm going to build that car I always dreamed of. So I went out and found a donor VR6 car and got to work. Very budget, you know, I think I spent, you know, a very little amount of money on acquiring the Rabbit and very little money acquiring the donor car, and then came the swap kits and the wiring harnesses and all that kind of thing that I just kind of acquired, and I wanted to kind of document that build, so I, you know, started up an Instagram page and kind of started, you know, showing people what I was doing and what my goal was, regardless of what they thought. I just kind of went along with what I wanted to do, and I think the VAG group, whether it's Volkswagen, Audi, you know, even Porsche for that matter, a lot of these parts, or quite a few of these parts, are interchangeable. It's like playing Lego. You can pick and choose the best of the best that's out there and find ways to bolt them together and make it all work and stuff them in any platform you want. And I think, you know, Mark IIs probably have the most range of being able to put pretty much anything into those cars. Mark I's aren't that far off. The lack of having a removable subframe and that stuff does limit you, but really you can do anything you can to a Mark I that you could a Mark II, as long as you kind of think about it and plan for it. But ultimately, the Lego-ness of Volkswagens is something that is super cool to me. And so anyways, when I went out and bought that and built that VR6 and that sort of thing, and you know, what brought me to this car was, you know, finding a door, because that car is probably never going to be finished, but it's getting closer to being finished. As far as being a project, it'll probably be an eternal project for the rest of my life. But it came to a point where now the car's built, it's running, it's on the road, and I started to look at bodywork and that kind of thing. So I bought this car for a door, like I mentioned in the very first episode. But the more I brought this car home, the more I looked at it, I just couldn't make peace with parting this car out. This car has to live on. We have to see another day. So then it opens up the conversation of, what do I want to do for a power plant for this car? Trust me, I've thought about this particular scenario playing out in my head many times, and I thought if I ever built another Mark I, I'd probably want to build it to be a 1.8T. And the reason why I'd want to build a 1.8T Mark I was, you know, back when I wanted my VR6, before I could afford it, or before it was achievable for that matter. Back then, when the swaps were happening and were becoming a little bit more common, enter the 1.8T into the picture, and people started doing those swaps as well. And the forums in the late 90s, early 2000s was all we had to go on when it came to exchange of information and kind of what you could find and how you could build a database of what swapped with what parts and what you needed to achieve this. What became seemingly the argument of that era was, what engine swap was better, a VR6 or a 1.8T? You know, out came the keyboard warriors about discussing what they truly believed was better and why it was better, having probably never owned either car or even played with other car, but they decided to throw in their 2 cents. There's plenty of people on there who were a great resource of information, who had these cars and had worked with them and knew what was needed and what was required to do these swaps. And everybody got into the conversation of why was one package better than the other, what reasons made one package better than the other, and so forth. When I went to build my Mark I VR6, I didn't really care about any of that. I didn't care about the power to weight argument. I didn't care about people saying VR6s are too heavy or anything like that. All I cared about was building the car that I dreamed of. And you know, the way I looked at it, I was going to build that car regardless of what other people thought. I wanted to build the car for me and what I wanted out of the car, much why the car has little to zero curb appeal. Everything has to do with how I built the car mechanically. And that's what I love about it so much. I built it to what I wanted when I was 16, 17, 18, 19, within that age range. You know, it has, you know, Mark II Recaros and you know, bigger brakes from a Mark IV, and you know, the VR6 and the whole transmission, cable shift, hydraulic clutch, that whole thing. I really wanted all of that back then, and so I decided, you know what, I'm going to finally build that car, and I did. And the argument in the forums of whether one was the other always led me to say, if I ever had another Rabbit or built another Rabbit, I would build a 1.8T to be able to personally compare for myself which car I thought was better with which either power plant. And I thought, wouldn't that be the coolest thing to do, is to have one of each, and to say, you know what, I can speak from my own understanding that I have both, and I can directly compare them both and tell you which one I prefer more and why. So kind of right out of the gate, I felt like that was the direction I was going to go with this car. And the more and more I thought about it, you know, those builds are becoming more common, a lot more people are doing it. I really didn't really care too much the more I thought about it, about that particular argument. Like, who am I, what is it, why would I even bother trying to prove that point, and what does it care to me about that? So I started to think of back to why I truly fell in love with these cars, and it had everything to do with that whole raw road feel and that kind of thing. And I really loved the classic nature of these cars, and I thought maybe I should build something that I want. I would build a classic 90s spec build about what I could have built when I owned my first Mk1, or what I should have built, or what have you, back then, and think about an NA style build that keeps this car true to its classic format, and playing around with the Mk1, Mk2, Mk3 option of parts, and finding something that is very focused on Volkswagen specific. Very little aftermarket. I mean, I'm going to put some aftermarket parts in this car without question. You know, there's a couple suppliers of parts that I really enjoy to work with. But when it comes to what I want from this car, is I want to build it 90 spec. I want to build it the power and affordability of what it was when I was 16, 17, 18, what I could have done then. I want to do it again. And that build brings me to the build that I bought, or the car that I bought for the donor package to this car. I should say, for one, this car that I purchased was built to that focus 26, 7, 8 years ago, and then parked for 25 years. This car has not been touched or worked with in about 24 years. And when I saw this car for the first time, I was like, that is the perfect donor of what I'm trying to achieve here. There's obviously parts I need to buy outside of this particular donor car, but there is so much that comes with this particular car that really defines this build to me, and why I want to do it, and what I want to do with it. Naturally aspirated, no 1.8T, no VR6, no 2.5 liter 5-cylinder, none of that stuff. We're gonna have very little electronics, and we're gonna stick to the pure reality of how these cars excited me in the beginning. And without further ado, let's go there's one other thing I should say before I get into this. There is going to be some Volkswagen purists out there that are going to rake me over the coals for this. Before I show you this car and know that I'm going to be dismantling it as a donor, please understand that while this car is super cool, there is no way this car could be saved. Trust me in saying that if this car could be saved, I would save it, but it can't. This car is beyond rusty. This is the rustiest car I have probably ever seen, but it has the most amount of unique, cool parts on it that I could probably ever find in a single donor car. Without further ado, let's go take a look. I bought a 1979 Volkswagen Scirocco. now that you've seen how much of a bucket this car is, let's take a look at all the cool parts it has. So as you can see, that car has a ton of sweet parts on it. You know, there's obviously the car's beyond rusty, but a lot of those parts are really cool. They're going to make a lot of really unique fitment onto this car. All of that Mark 1 crosses over really well. It's all bolt-on, same platform. Things like the wheels, rebuilt transmission, 2-liter bottom end, the head, all that stuff's going to come over to this car. Strut bars, top and bottom, front, back, those will all come over here. I'll probably put different suspension on it. Again, those wheels are going to go onto this car. I'll lower this car down. A lot of those components will fit directly on this car. What won't, I'll probably sell off to fund the purchase of the car, hopefully, and then some. We'll see how that goes. And then as we kind of build into the car, I'll start to explain the rest of it, of what I'm going to do. Like I said, that car has been parked for 24 years. It hasn't been started or anything. So one of my main focuses for our next episode will be to try and see if that motor starts. I do know that motor is not stuck. It does turn over, so we're gonna have to start to play around with it. I understand the fuel tank's rusted out, so it doesn't contain any fuel, so we'll have to bring or build a temporary fuel system in order to support that motor. But I would like to try and fire it up in that chassis before we swap it over. None of the fuel injection components, which I will drop right now, none of those fuel injection components are going to stay. I am going to put that motor on carbs. I want to run it on twin Webers. I think that part is back to that, you know, defined raw aspect of this car. Putting it on twin Weber 45s is roughly my goal there. That may change as far as sizing or what have you, but I do want to make it carbureted. I do want to make it a very raw build. And for those aspects, guys, stay tuned till next episode. Please like and subscribe to this video if you want to catch more of these episodes. Again, I am going to try and drop an episode every Wednesday. For now, for the rest of eternity, I do have a 50-hour-a-week plus job, so I am trying to do it outside of that, but I am going to work very hard to stay focused on bringing content to you guys every week. This build will rapidly take place, take you along for the ride as we go, and have some real fun with it. So thanks very much, guys. Really appreciate all the comments. Appreciate all the love I've been getting so far. Things are great in that aspect. And again, I'm going to continue to build this car the way I like, and we'll see where it goes. Thanks very much, guys. Till next time, see you later.